Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the final session of the day. We have three speakers for this final session. The first is Hazel Bateman, who is professor at the UNSW Business School, and she will talk for 15 minutes about retirement incomes. And then once you're done, you can sit here, and then we'll get the other speakers up and I'll introduce them as they begin. I think we'll stay with the same game plan, 15 minutes, 3 times, and then generalized question and answer. Thank you very much. Hazel. Can you be here?
I was going to stand up, John.
All right.
Okay, so thank you very much. And actually, I haven't done this before, but I'd actually like to publicly thank John for getting me into this retirement income game. 24 years ago, I was a Treasury public servant looking to do a PhD or something at UNSW, and I contacted this head of school that I didn't know, saying, is there any tutoring that I could do to support my studies? And this head of school said, we've got no tutoring, so he was lying, but I've just got this little grant to work on super. And I've been distracted now for 24 years, haven't I? Okay, so there's a lot of things to talk about with retirement income. Now, I guess the key underlying thing of what I want to say is we've generated a retirement income system in this country that relies a lot on people making decisions. So we have a system where there's a lot of individual choices and we're relying on people to make decisions. And unless people make good decisions, we won't actually have a retirement income system that gives them a good retirement incomes that last for the whole of their life. So that's sort of the underlying thing of what I want to talk about. And we're really the first in the world to do this. So I think we've been having a bit of trial and error with policy. We don't quite know how to deal with these choices and decisions and what sort of help to give people. But we don't really have another country to look at because there's really no one else who the main part of their retirement income is private saving and individual accounts where people have a lot of choice about funds, about investment and about benefits. And so we're really on our own and the rest of the world is looking to us to how to solve these policy questions. So first I'm just going to talk a little bit about retirement income provision and then assess this in the context of population ageing, talk about some challenges and then some future directions and things we can think about for future policy. And of course, I've started by going the wrong way. So as many of you know, we have a multi-pillar or 3-pillar retirement income system. And this is really now the world standard in what we should do. We should have a multi-pillar system. So we have an aged pension, general revenue finance, provides a safety net. In our case, it's means tested. We have a superannuation guarantee, which is private saving in individual accounts. Most of it is defined contribution, except for public servants and uni-super members who are in defined benefit schemes. And we have voluntary superannuation and other saving. And I'm going to miss these slides because I know I'll talk too long. One of the key things with our system, though, is it's still maturing. So we've only had a superannuation guarantee for 22 years. Before we had the superannuation guarantee, before we had productivity award super, before that, less than 50% of the population actually had superannuation. And so for many people, they've only had superannuation for just over 20 years. It started off at a fairly low contribution rate. It went up to 9% by the early 2000s. It's now 9.5%. It may or may not go to 12%. But as you can see here, we've got a situation where people currently retiring, on average, don't actually have a lot of superannuation. So if you look at the top line there, we've got the mean male accumulation around age 60 is about $240,000. So at the moment, we're not actually talking about a lot of people with a lot of superannuation. Many people in this room are quite unusual. Many of us have quite a lot of superannuation. Many of us are in defined benefit schemes. Many of us are in unfunded defined benefit schemes. But we're not the norm. Most of the population is somewhere different. So it's important here to remember that at the moment we've got a system in transition. It's going to take a while before most people retire with very large accumulations. We've also got to remember at the moment that if we look at the whole household portfolio, and this is showing for different parts of the household portfolio, financial assets, superannuation, owner-occupier housing, other property, the composition of total assets. And if you look at the people at the moment, people over age 45, it's actually owner-occupier housing that's the largest part of their household portfolio. Much larger than superannuation, probably for many people larger than superannuation and financial assets added together. Now, when I talk to younger people, anyone under 40 will tell me that it won't look like that when they're older because they can't get into the housing market, particularly in Sydney. But at the moment, this is telling us something about there's a resource there that can also be used to provide people for income in retirement. You know, there's a lot of owner-occupier housing sitting there as well, which is much larger than the assets in superannuation. So just looking at our scheme, assessing our scheme, thinking, is it working or not? Is it good or not? One of the many positives of our scheme is that it's a multi-pillar scheme. So as I mentioned earlier, we have a public pension, which is general revenue funded, which is a safety net, which is a defined benefit scheme in a way. We have the superannuation guarantee, which is a private scheme, which is defined contribution. And so we have diversification between public provision, between private provision, between funded and unfunded. And it's also world's best practice. So this morning in John's introduction, he talked about a book called Averting the Old Age Crisis, which was put out by the World Bank about 20 years ago. And what they talked about there was the benefits of multi-pillars, and their idea here was risk diversification. Many other countries rely a lot on publicly funded or sort of publicly unfunded defined benefit public pensions, and we're really quite different. We're actually following what the World Bank set up as the ideal best practice pension system over 20 years ago. And I think because of that, compared to other countries which have relied on unfunded public pensions, we're in a much better position. A system such that the one we have has much better implications for overall equity, particularly intergenerational equity, and also has efficiency impacts as well. Now, again, this morning, there was a bit of a discussion about why aren't public servants staying at work longer? And a lot of us were saying, well, it's because of the defined benefit pensions. Well, if we look at that on a national scale, if we didn't have the superannuation guarantee, but we had a system such as a publicly funded public pension, which was defined benefit, which encouraged everyone to leave work at age 60, well, probably everyone would leave work at age 60. So there's lots of benefits from a system like ours in terms of overall efficiency and equity. Our system also has high coverage. So the superannuation guarantee, as we know, covers just about everyone. You have to earn less than $450 a month not to be covered. Now, that $450 hasn't changed for 22 years. It used to be something like 15% of income. It's probably now about 5% of income. We also know that our system potentially has high adequacy. So if you read the Treasury RIM reports, which assume that everybody reaches retirement after 40 years of working and buys a lifetime annuity, adding that to the age pension, they can probably get 70 to 80% replacement. Now, we know that that doesn't happen, and we know that people are not going to work for 40 years. People are not going to make the decisions to turn everything to a lifetime annuity, but that's the potential that we have in the system. We also know that we have a lot of assets in superannuation funds, so we're the fourth largest collection of superannuation or pension assets in the world. And if this counts or not, we're actually ranked 2 by the Melbourne Mercer Global Pension Index. We can sort of take this lightly, but when you look at that pension index, there's some reasonable science on how it's calculated, and there's a lot of different things that go into the calculation, including measures of adequacy, sustainability, integrity, which includes the governance of the system. So, I think on a world scheme, of looking at worldwide, our system ranks quite well. I guess my message is, particularly in the context of an ageing population, we shouldn't get too complacent. That was the slide ahead. Okay. Looking at the ageing population, as we've talked about before, the age dependency ratio is going to probably grow from 20 to 40%. But given that we've got a means-tested age pension that provides benefits at a fairly modest level, that we've got private retirement saving in the form of superannuation, the impact of the ageing population in our system is really quite modest compared to many other countries. But what I really want to say is we shouldn't be too complacent about this. So looking at the overall metrics, it looks as though the retirement income system is going on okay. But there's some things that we really need to think about. Underlying the superannuation system, we've got a very complex policy framework. So we know that our system is largely based on a tax system, where we tax contributions, fund earnings differently by different contributions and fund earnings. We have a means-tested public pension that sits in that in a quite complicated way. There's also concerns about the superannuation industry itself, the industry where our savings go. So there's questions about the costs, the efficiency, the governance of that industry. There's also the issue that having adequate superannuation to retire on relies on a lot of good individual decisions. So in our system, we can choose our fund, our investment, we can decide to contribute more or less, we can choose our benefits, and making sure that we've got adequate retirement savings for people really depends on individuals making good decisions. And it's possible that our system is really too complex for people to do this without help. And finally, and probably most importantly, all of the policy focus has been on accumulation. And so we don't really have a very well articulated accumulation policy. So for the past 24 years, there's been discussion on what should the superannuation guarantee rate be, about investment of our superannuation assets, about choice of fund, but we really haven't talked enough as a population, as an economy, as academics, as policymakers, about what people should do with that accumulation once they reach retirement. And some of these key things I want to just spend a little bit more time on. The two things that I'm really interested in spending a bit more time on is the responsibility on individuals to make decisions so that they can have a comfortable retirement, and the lack of policy focus on decumulation and possibly what we can do about it. Okay. Is that 5 or 0 or 1? Okay. So as I said, we have a system based on defined contributions. Individuals have the responsibility to make a lot of decisions in that system. And these are quite complicated, complex financial decisions. So to undertake these decisions or these choices, people need a skill set. They probably need to understand something about the super system. They need to be engaged with superannuation. They need to understand the information that funds give them, that the government prescribes in disclosures, and they're probably going to have to rely on financial advice. And what I'm going to just show and I've been spending a lot of time over the last 5 or 6 years doing research, working out whether people have these skills and whether the level of these skills actually matters for the decisions that people make. And as you can probably guess, many people don't have these skills, and people with poor skills, at least in hypothetical sense, in experiments, are making very bad decisions. So just to give you some idea, people have very poor financial literacy. So these are very simple questions on interest rates, inflation, and risk diversification, which are used around the world to gauge financial literacy. And we find that 52% of Australians aged 50 to 65, only 52% can answer all 3 questions, and they're really quite basic questions. In a lot of the work I do, we undertake online experiments, and as part of that we can ask a whole range of questions to people. So we can ask them about their numeracy, their financial literacy, their system knowledge, and we find that people have very poor knowledge of the superannuation system. So even asking people, what is the compulsory contribution rate in ranges of 5 or 6? Is it somewhere between 6 and 12, or is it somewhere between 12 and 18? A third of people can't answer that question. If we ask people, what is a balanced fund? I don't know if anyone here knows what a balanced fund is, but it's basically the default fund. So if you don't choose an investment option for your super fund will put it in a balanced fund. 60% of people thought a balanced fund was cash and fixed interest. So, and these are large, very, very large representative samples. These are not just half a dozen people that we go and interview in the street. So there's very poor knowledge of financial literacy, there's very poor knowledge of the system. We wonder why people don't buy annuities. Now, academics talk about the annuity puzzle, and they say, oh, it's adverse selection, it's liquidity, it's bequests, it's a whole range of reasons why people don't buy annuities. But if you go out and ask pre-retirees, aged between 50 and 64, which we've done in a number of studies, we basically find out that nobody knows what they are. No, and have you heard of a life annuity? Only a third of people on average have heard. Does it offer lifetime income? 20% thought that it offered lifetime income. Does it offer a guaranteed income level? 8% knew that it offered a guaranteed income level. And so the problem is we've generated a system where people get to retirement, our policy allows people choice of retirement benefit, and yet the sorts of things as economists that we say people should consider in their portfolio, the general public don't have a clue about. And this is really exacerbated that not only don't the general public know, but the financial advisors who are supposed to be advising them don't know either. One of the things I do in a sideline, I also teach and research and do other things, but I've been developing a course this year for financial advisors to actually teach them about retirement planning and to talk to them about the risks in retirement and different products. And a life annuity isn't even in the standard textbook that financial advisors use. And retirement planning isn't included in the compulsory courses under their RG 146 that ASSA sets. So it's not surprising that financial advisors don't even know what the products are either. So how do we help people? We help people perhaps by, or the government helps people by giving them information through financial product disclosures. Now we know over 15 years ago when the government first started doing this, we had 200-page financial product disclosure statements. Recently, we now have 8-page financial product disclosure statements. And what I've got up here, if anyone's a member of UniSuper who's not in the defined benefit scheme, who actually is making a choice, this is the investment page in the 8-page financial product disclosure from UniSuper. And the idea was that people should use this to make decisions. Now, we did some experiments using this, and we found out that what people focused on was the picture in the middle. So we could do some experiments looking at choices and then working out econometrically which piece of information they used most, and they used that bit in the middle. And if it had more pieces in the pie, they were more likely to choose that investment option. So it's not clear that even that people know how to use this information, and I'm sure John's going to push me on in a minute. Looking at financial advice, we rely on financial advice, and this is a result of an ASSA shadow shopping study, clients' view of advice. 86% of clients thought the advice was good. ASSA thought that only 6% of the advice was good. And so we're asking people to rely on advice, and they don't know if it's good or bad. Talking about decumulation, I'm down to 0. We see that there's a preference move from lump sums to income streams. That green line here are account-based pensions. Most people are just going for an account-based pension. Those little dots up there are life annuities. Very, very few people are buying life annuities. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of it might be because people don't know about them, because financial advisors don't know about them, and it's also not in their interest to sell a life annuity because they'll never see their client again. But the problem is, looking at the long term, that if people are buying non-annuitised products, you may get the age pension, but we know it's only 28% of earnings. That's going to leave people in the long term vulnerable to investment risk, inflation risk, and longevity risk. And that's a real policy concern for the long term. And I'm going to skip right through to my next slide. I mentioned the tax system. One of the problems we have is a very complicated tax system. We have a flat tax and we do 1,000 different things to it, as we can see up here. We do 1,000 different things to contributions to try and make it behave like a progressive tax. If we were anywhere else in the world, our tax system would look like that. We wouldn't tax anything on superannuation until we got to benefits, and we tax people at their marginal tax rates. And the fact that we're doing very complicated things leads to problems with equity and efficiency, administrative efficacy, and lots of things which are going to affect our superannuation system in the long term. Okay, and I've got one more slide. So this is what we need to do. We need to help people with their retirement saving and spending decisions. We need to improve the choice architecture. Perhaps we need better, well-defined defaults, particularly in the retirement benefit area. And I'm not saying we should default everyone into a life annuity, but we need to think very carefully about what sort of products people should be taking to cover their risks in retirement. We need to get people more engaged and interested in their super, and we need to work out how to give good quality mass market advice without having to depend on the current financial advice system. We need a well-articulated decumulation policy that's got to come from government. Government has to say that superannuation is for retirement incomes, not to save a pot of money, and we probably need to reform the taxation of super. And that was only 5 minutes over. There's 24 years of work in there, John.
Sit up here and crane your neck if you wish. Thank you very much, Hazel. The next presentation is by Jane Hall, who is Professor of Health Economics at the UTS Business School, has been running a Centre of Health Economics for many years, and is somehow, I don't want to say older statesman exactly, but that's kind of what you are in health economics.
It's all right. My own perception of myself relative to age completely changed when I became a grandmother. Congratulations, I heard that. Okay, so I normally deal with sort of the big questions of the healthcare system, and ageing is one of them. So what I want to cover as briefly as I can is looking at healthcare expenditure through the prism of ageing, and what does that mean for what we understand about our current health benefits. And I use the word entitlement. I hope you recognise why I would use that in this context. If you don't, you can ask me at the question time. So I'm going to start with the big scary picture. This is the big scary picture that shows that health is going to eat the Commonwealth budget. And this is, of course, why we can't have any sort of entitlement. And the reason for it, according to the Minister, this is the Minister for Health speaking in the post-budget briefings, is it's all the fault of us older generation. Australians are now living 25 years longer. And this, he does at least admit that's an improvement, comes with a rapidly rising price tag, and the $62 billion the government currently spends each year on health will blow out another $13 billion over the next 4 years. So we're facing this tsunami of expenditure, and it's the fault of old people. That's the context that we start with. Now let's just see how robust that is. Well, it's certainly clear that age brings chronic illness. These data come from HILDA. I'm going to show you a set of graphs that come from HILDA and also come from the New South Wales 45 and up study. And as you can see, this is the number of long-term conditions. Now, can I get this going? No, you'll just have to follow it. Yes, I can. And you can see that it's very, here, this is the standard box and whisker plot. It's not impossible, but it gets more difficult as you get over the age of 50 to get away with having no chronic conditions. And gradually the number of chronic conditions we have rises, but really what is remarkable is the extraordinary variability we see around this median, that there are enormous differences in health status even within age groups. And partly that's because what it means to have a chronic condition has changed. Now, this is just a focus on type 2 diabetes, which is the diabetes you get when you're old. And if we look at a generation ago and we look at now, everything has changed. How it's diagnosed is changed. It's changed, so it's much earlier. So we're telling people they've got diabetes. We don't even tell them they've got diabetes now. We tell them they've got pre-diabetes. So we give them a condition that wouldn't have been found until much later. But the way that condition is treated and the ensuing quality of life for people is dramatically different. Having a chronic disease now doesn't mean that you stop living life as you knew it. For many of them, you maintain a very high level of functioning, whereas a generation ago, We take diabetes, for example. Those people had repeated emergency department visits because of poor diabetic control. They automatically lost their driver's licenses. So that's changed. The other thing that's changed is that we can medicate people. And this is data from the OECD, which shows you that Australia, here, is the largest consumer of anti-cholesterol medications in the known OECD world. Now, Keith, my co-author, and I have a new hypothesis about this after morning tea. It's the scones and cream effect of morning tea that makes Australians so much higher. But again, if you look on this side, this shows the growth in the consumption of these particular medications as the recommendations or the threshold guideline has changed. And those thresholds are being lowered successively over time, and it opens up either, depending on how you look at it, an increasing number of people with this chronic condition that needs intervention, or a fantastic marketing opportunity if you're the pharmaceutical company. So what does that mean for how people feel about their health? So this is a fairly standard health status measure that is based on asking individuals a series of questions. And again, what I want you to see, and we can talk about the measure perhaps more in the question time, is that old age doesn't necessarily mean that things get terrible. Again, we look at the median and we see it certainly drops, particularly after the age of 75. But again, let me point out to you that variation. So although there are people with very poor perceptions of their own health, there are still quite a number of people with good ratings of their own health. Okay, so are all these supposedly sicker people rushing off to the doctor? And this slide tells you that they're not. So this is visits to general practitioners. So this is where the health system starts. And again, what I think is really interesting here is that when we look at this, it's not that the median number of visits is increasing anywhere near as much as, again, this distribution. And as we get people to be older, there are certainly more people at the high end. But again, there's this story of variation. Can we explain it by age and chronic conditions? And this shows you the increase in healthcare expenditure, this is males, this is females, by numbers of chronic conditions. This is the average, and this is the median. And this is the 10 to 90%. So again, we're showing you, so what we're showing you with these graphs is mean, median, and variation. And what you see is the increases in the mean are driven a lot by the increases in the average, which are being driven by this greater and greater variation. And we get greater variation with increasing age and greater variation with increasing number of conditions. So again, we're not seeing this simple relationship, we're seeing increasing variation. Now, the other thing people who study this sort of stuff are interested in looking at is expenditure by time to death, because it's been observed over many countries, no, he's not waving at me yet, many countries for a long period of time that an awful lot of money is spent in the months preceding death. So here again, we have the same sort of graph, but again showing you not only does in the year before death spending increase, but look at the increase in variation. It's absolutely enormous. So where is that money being spent? So this again is looking at where the money is being spent in the year before death, and most of it is here, and this is in public hospitals. So that's where this the majority of expenditure is being driven in this hospital treatment in the months before death. So what can we take from that? Well, here's my summary. Age isn't destiny in terms of health status. What we see is wide variation in health status, even at older ages. We still see this wide variation, with some people being in remarkably good health. Although we see the prevalence of chronic conditions rising, you can't compare that with a generation ago, because what we call a chronic condition, how we diagnose it and how we treat it is changing dramatically and very fast. We do see expenditure concentrated in a relatively small group of people, and I cut out those particular slides under great pressure from the conference organisers, but 80% of expenditure is contributed by about 25% of people, and that pattern remains even in the older ages. Even in the plus 80s, we get that same sort of concentration. Certainly, number of chronic conditions is associated with increased costs, but not all increased number of chronic conditions lead to blowouts in costs. What we see is increased variability. We see this sharp increasing in spending in the year to death, but that's also associated with increased variability. And most of that expenditure happens in hospitals. And why are hospitals so expensive? It's because they do nasty things to you that most well-informed people don't want to have happen to them. Most people, and there's empirical evidence for this, would prefer to die peacefully at home rather than in a hospital intensive care unit with tubes in every orifice and other bits measuring other things on bits that don't open. So what happens in hospitals is clear. Well, I had to wake you up. Is clearly a challenge. So having sort of seen what the data tells us, what do we know about this then pressure on expenditure? Well, this is the latest Australian Institute of Health and Welfare data, and this just shows in constant prices the rise in healthcare expenditure over the last 10 years. And what you can see is a bit of a flattening off. And indeed, what we've seen in the latest expenditure data is that the growth in healthcare expenditure is at its lowest in 20, is David Kalish still here? 20-something years, I think it is. 3 minutes, perfect. So we're not seeing this extra 25 years pushing healthcare expenditure, not in this year's data. Is that a blip? Well, let's have a look at the OECD. And this, I think, is a very interesting graph, so I'm just going to explain it to you. What this shows is the impact of the various recession-like conditions and financial crises. So this was in the 70s, the 90s, and then the 2000s, using the peak of the crisis as that point. What you can see is that healthcare spending is unaffected by those fiscal recessionary style conditions in the short term, but it does lower after that with something of a lag, and it doesn't pick up. And these successive crises have led to lower and lower rates of healthcare spending. So what does that mean about the blowout in healthcare spending? Well, this is my standard slide of the challenge for financing and funding healthcare, and one of the big issues over the last few years, almost decade, has been the sustainability of the system. Can it keep pace with the growth of demands? And I think what those expenditure data show, much more briefly than I would normally do it, is that we don't have to worry about sustainability of the system in terms of this instant blowout in healthcare spending. So we can turn our attention to the other challenges. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about the need to ensure to to ensure that people are not prevented from getting care because they cannot afford it, and reducing the financial risk for those who do get care. I think still in the United States, the single largest cause of bankruptcy is healthcare costs that fall on the individual. So these set of aims come from WHO, so they're totally respectable, they're not just mine. So if we're actually going to do something about ensuring that we mitigate that risk, that financial risk, and ensure that there's access to healthcare, we need to provide some sort of insurance. But it doesn't have to be private healthcare insurance. You can look at a series of options around how you meet this insurance function. And it can be through private insurance, it can be through social health insurance, it can be through a government-provided insurance function, which is largely what we have with Medicare, or it can be a national health service, such as we have in the UK. Now, I don't have time to argue the merits and demerits of each case and why you might want to choose one, but the important message is that it's totally logical and sensible to choose a government-based insurance provision. It's not just a set of middle-class welfare or entitlement. And when we look at ageing, ensuring that we have this can be incredibly important. So this shows private health insurance in Australia coverage by age. And it goes up and down, particularly up with government policy. But look at what happens at around 60, at around retirement age, we see this drop off in private health insurance. So if we're concerned about access for the post-retirement or current retirement age group to healthcare, we should not be leaving it to the private health insurance market as we know it at the moment. Okay, so what can we do? We can look at, just because there isn't a crisis doesn't mean we shouldn't be looking at it. We can look at a whole range of issues around improvements in productivity, around the inflexibility of funding streams, about the financial disincentives for providing better types of care, about getting funding for new styles of care delivery, reduce overdiagnosis and overtreatment, improve workforce flexibility, and reduce the demarcation between different professions. And I quote the Productivity Commission, just to support my view. And so in terms of the call to action, I think we need to understand the variation that's driving the differences in costs. We need to improve productivity. And if I can finish with another quote, if death and taxes are certainly certain, then I think we need to reclaim death, and we need to ensure that we die in styles to which we aspire, and we need to reclaim our taxes and let them do sensible things. How's that?
Thank you very much, Jane. Our final speaker is Rachel Ong, who is at the Curtin School, a research fellow there, senior professor or research fellow there, I think.
Thank you, John, for that glowing introduction, but it's not professorial research fellow yet. It's principal research fellow at Banquest Curtin Economic Centre at Curtin University. So I'm going to talk about housing care and intergenerational relationships in my presentation today. So we all know by now that one of the key fiscal challenges that we face in an era of population aging is rising aged care costs, and how do we go about financing these costs. So what I want to do in this presentation is to delve deeper into this issue by exploring a potential policy direction for funding aged care costs, and that is asking the elderly to draw down on their housing equity to pay for aged care. Now, I know this is a really contentious policy proposal, but recommendations along these lines have been gaining momentum slowly in countries like the UK and even here in Australia. So I think it is critical that we have a serious think about what are the pros and cons of going down this direction of asking the elderly to tap into their own housing assets to pay for their aged care needs. And in particular, I want to look at what are the intergenerational implications. Okay, I'd like to begin by just emphasizing the importance of designing and assessing policy through an intergenerational lens. We all know that people are living longer than before, and therefore we have growing numbers of coexisting generations. So when policy is being formulated, there is a need increasingly to look at the needs of not just one, but multiple generations. And issues around intergenerational equity has become more and more important. In the area of aged care, a key question that we need to ask is how do we preserve the elderly's access to adequate levels of publicly funded welfare, in this case, aged care, without encumbering younger generations in their lifetime economic prospects. So, you know, there's always this tension between meeting the needs of one generation without encumbering the aspirations of the next generation. And we do know that the demand for aged care services is going to grow. It is growing, and it is going to continue to grow substantially. We've got lots of projected estimates by the Treasury, by the Productivity Commission as well. We know that by 2050, the number of aged care recipients is projected to rise by 150%. We know that the number of Australians aged 85 years and over who we think are the major aged care recipients is projected to more than quadruple by 2050. And we also have statistics that say that aged care expenditure is projected to more than double by 2050. So you've got all these statistics pointing towards and actually demanding that some policy adjustment be made in anticipation of these rising aged care costs. So why housing? Why target housing? Well, there are several reasons for that. One has been the long-standing policies among successive governments that give preferential tax transfer treatment to housing assets. In Australia, well, some examples, we have a capital gains tax exemption, we have land tax exemption for homeowners, non-means tested first homeowners grant, and the exemption of the primary home from assets testing. Those are just some examples of preferential tax transfer treatment being given to home ownership, which encourages the accumulation of housing wealth by Australians. The second set of factors are what some people are calling a one-off bonanza, but really, you know, just a set of remarkable market conditions that the baby boomer generation has enjoyed. Soaring house prices from the mid-1990s to the early 2000s, till before the GFC even, publicly funded tertiary education, relatively stable labor markets, and these have all taken place during the wealth accumulation years of the baby boomer generation. And it's reasonable that, you know, to expect that this set of conditions are not going to return again anytime soon. So the younger generation is not going to be enjoying this set of conditions, which the older generation has enjoyed. And these set of conditions have actually enabled them to accumulate pretty high levels of housing wealth. Okay, despite high levels of housing wealth, traditionally they are illiquid. So they're stored in the property, they're a form of wealth. But in recent years, we've seen the development of equity release products that have actually allowed homeowners to mobilize their housing wealth and actually unlock some of that wealth into income streams that can fund consumption or pressing spending needs. And in the case of aged care, recommendations are for the use of some of these equity release products to fund aged care needs. So what I've just got up here are some signs of incremental shifts towards what I'm calling a housing asset-based system for financing aged care in Australia and abroad as well. Under the July 2014 aged care financing reforms, there was an emphasis on national means testing and user charges, which take into account income and assets, including the primary home. In Australia, the Productivity Commission has recommended the drawdown of housing equity to fund aged care needs, and the same thing has been happening in the UK. They had a Dilnot Commission report at around the same time which made the same recommendations. But as I said before, this is a contentious policy proposal. So really, what is the case for going down this policy direction, and what are the negatives that are associated with going down this policy direction? I'm just going to start by talking about the pros, and then I'll talk a bit about the cons. Hopefully I'll make it in time within the 15 minutes that I have. Firstly, there is a growing gap between the older and the younger generations with respect to housing wealth. So what I've got up here is a chart showing how homeownership rates have changed between 1990 and 2010, so about 2 decades. The green bars represent 1990 and the blue bars represent 2010. And I've just taken two age groups, the 65 plus years group and the under 35s. So what you can see is that back in the 1990s, 80% of those aged 65 years and over were homeowners. Whereas back in the 1990s, only about half of those aged under 35 were homeowners. Now that's to be expected, of course, given the younger age group have had less time to accumulate housing wealth. But the interesting thing is the change in the trend over the 2 decades. By 2010, the share of homeownership, homeownership rate amongst the elderly has grown from 80% to about 85%, whereas amongst the under 35, it's actually dipped from 50% to about 39%. And reflecting these trends, the share of the population's housing wealth that is owned by the elderly has actually grown significantly from about 25% back in 1990 to about 38% in the year 2010. Whereas for the under 35s, their share of the population's housing wealth has actually fallen from 11% to about 4%. So you can see this widening intergenerational gap with the elderly holding more and more of the population's housing wealth. And in fact, the younger generation is increasingly being dubbed Generation Rent because so many are finding it so difficult to make it into the homeownership market themselves. So it is arguably reasonable on equity grounds to expect the elderly to tap into some of the high levels of wealth that they own in order to meet aged care expenses and thus reduce some of the fiscal burden on the younger generation who, in fact, are finding it hard to become homeowners themselves. The second reason why there is a case for such a proposal is that it may actually reduce inequality within the younger generations. What do I mean by that? Look, there is a consensus in the literature that it's those who come from affluent socioeconomic backgrounds who are most likely to inherit large amounts of assets. Okay, so the rich are the ones who are more likely to inherit assets. So intergenerational transfers can become a vehicle through which existing inequality within the younger generation can become more entrenched or exacerbated. I've got some figures up here using the Hilda survey. The green bars just represent those who receive a bequest. I'm sorry that the diagram's a bit messed up, but the green bars represent those who receive a bequest in 2011, and the blue bars represent those who did not receive a bequest in 2011. So the green bars are all basically higher than the blue bars, and what they really are saying is that those who receive a bequest were, in 2011, were in the previous year more likely to be living in an advantaged area, as indicated by the CIFA quintile. They could more easily raise emergency funds, they're more likely to be employed, and they're also more likely to be university qualified. So this just gives an indication that those who end up receiving bequests are actually the ones who are already from relatively affluent socioeconomic backgrounds. So if we're asking the elderly to release some of their equity to fund their aged care needs, this may actually help to mitigate the perpetuation of wealth inequality across generation that can take place through bequests. But of course, there are some negatives associated with this proposal, and the key one has to do with the tension between the desire within an elderly parent to transfer housing assets to adult children and the need to fund his or her own personal aged care needs. At the moment, there's a lack of appropriate insurance against the risks that are associated with equity release. So that might, an elderly person who releases equity to meet aged care needs might find himself or herself with equity levels below what he or she has anticipated, and therefore that might in turn reduce bequests below anticipated levels. 5 minutes, okay. The second point, or the second concern here is that young adults are living in a more precarious era than before. They face rising tertiary education costs. They face increasingly unaffordable housing markets. And they have relatively more precarious labor market prospects than previous generations. So if we go down this policy direction, we may in fact be asking parents to draw down on their housing equity at a time when their children are going to need to rely on intergenerational transfers a whole lot more in order to achieve their own economic aspirations in life. The third concern that might be associated with this policy proposal is behavioral effects. So the most popular or well-known equity release product that we know of in Australia is, say, reverse mortgages. They're targeted at the elderly. But the fact is that for more than 20 years, there has existed flexible mortgage products that allow people, homeowners, to actually draw down their housing equity at any point across their life course. So it's not something that you have to wait until you're 62 to qualify for a reverse mortgage to do. So might we witness some behavioral effects in which older homeowners start to draw down their housing wealth earlier in the life course if they're thinking of transferring their assets to adult children, to avoid, before they come to the place where they actually need aged care. So those are some of the pros and cons coming from an intergenerational perspective. I'm going to end by talking about just a few other policy considerations that we need to think about if we're thinking of going down this path of asking the elderly to tap into their housing assets and pay for their own aged care needs. The first is risks. There are a multitude of risks associated with equity release, house price risk, interest rate risk. Who is going to bear those risks? Now, we cannot expect the elderly, who tend to be in a more vulnerable stage of their life course by the time they need aged care, we can't expect them to bear all of the risk. So there needs to be a serious conversation about who should bear the risk, how that risk should be distributed, and what the government's role is. Might there be a role for the government to be a potential insurer against downside risks of equity release, if the wealth that is released is going to be used to actually fund aged care needs and therefore relieve some fiscal tension? Secondly, I'd like to make a point that housing assets are at best an incomplete source of welfare. The reason being that there is a significant minority of older people who have not accumulated housing wealth across their lifetime, and therefore they are lifetime renters. They do not have access to housing wealth. They can't be expected to draw upon their housing equity to fund their aged care needs. There is also another trend, which is that loss of home ownership is no longer an uncommon occurrence in the current century. So some data that I have from the Hilda survey shows that of the 9.2 million home ownership spells that were ongoing between 2001 and 2010, 21% of those home ownership spells, that's about 2 million home ownership spells, ended with exits into rental housing. And of these exits into rental housing, about 1/3 were enduring, which is to say that those people who left never made it back into home ownership. And these exits are typically linked with adverse life events such as, say, divorce. So I know that some exits are, people do it because they want to do it, but many of these exits in my previous research I found are actually linked with adverse life events. So loss of homeownership is no longer an uncommon occurrence, and they can occur in mid to late life. So again, people who lose homeownership then no longer can rely on their housing assets to fund aged care. And finally, we can think about possibly, instead of asking the elderly to draw down on their equity to fund aged care needs, possibly going down the path of providing more policy support for family models of aged care. There are opportunities for two-way intergenerational support there, perhaps grandparents providing childcare while they themselves receiving aged care from their adult children. But again, there are some issues we need to think about if we're going to go down the path of promoting family models of aged care. There is a conflict between the unpaid provision of informal care to family and participation in the paid labour market. Most informal carers in Australia are women. and there are gender equality issues here. So I think if we're going to go down this path of promoting informal care, then policies will need to carefully navigate the tension between encouraging household provision of aged care services versus lifting economic productivity through greater female labor force participation. And both of these are very necessary policy ambitions in an era of population aging. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. We have about a quarter of an hour, 20 minutes for questions and comments. If you could give your name and affiliation, we have some microphones, I believe.
I'm David DeVoe, University of Queensland. Hazel, the capacity for people to take lump sums from the superannuation, is that consistent with the goals of retirement incomes policy? And what would be the impact on government expenditure if that lump sum capacity was curtailed?
Okay, I'm trying to think how to answer. Okay, under current government policy, you've got choice as to what benefit you might take, a lump sum, an account-based pension or an annuity. These days, about 50% of superannuation assets are taken as lump sums. A chart I had up very quickly earlier showed maybe 10 or 20 years ago, 80% of benefits were taken as lump sums. So many people are taking lump sums. I think what people are actually doing with their lump sums is often paying off debt and doing sort of short-term things, to tell the truth. Trying to think. One of the implications of taking a lump sum is you're actually taking funds out of a tax-preferred superannuation system. So people who are taking lump sums, if they're doing anything in financial assets, are actually paying more tax than they would if it was sitting in the superannuation system. But I think there's an overall trend for people to take income streams. Most people are taking account-based pension income streams. Most people are drawing down just the minimum requirement to get the tax concessions. And it's possible that people don't have very much money, they're going to draw it down too quickly, or people are maybe going to just sit on it and it's going to still be there when they die. And so one of the things I would say is that the government needs to give guidance to people on how to actually draw that down. And some of the data from Hilda actually shows that people are sitting on the money. So even people on low incomes are saving in retirement because they're not drawing down progressively. They're just trying to self-insure for longevity.
I have a question here. I don't know where the microphone is. And then over here.
Ian MacDonald from Melbourne University. I have, two questions. One is to Hazel. With regard to, when you ask people about financial literacy and these questions, I suppose the question arises is just how important these questions are. Does it really matter? It's interesting that a Nobel laureate in finance, when he was asked whether he used his stuff to decide on the proportion of his wealth that he had in bonds and shares, he said, oh, no, I split it 50-50. So it seems to me that somehow it would be good if the questions were more, the information was sort of more oriented towards, success and failure, rather than, had there was some...
I'd like to answer that question, actually. Yeah, so around the world, these financial literacy questions are sort of set aside as the gold standard. If you can answer these, then you're capable of making decisions and you plan and whatever. The work that we've done here, we run what we call experimental surveys. So we have representative samples of thousands of people. And we ask these questions, I tell you why we started doing it, because you want to get published in places and the financial literacy sort of mafia assesses your papers. But as well as those questions, we always put in sets of numeracy questions, and importantly, sets of questions that ask about the actual system. which is why I showed a couple of those questions. And in fact, the strongest covariates are the numeracy questions. So people need to be numerate to understand the superannuation and make choices, and people need to understand the system. And the financial literacy questions are actually not as significant in our modelling as the other questions. There's now a movement questioning the financial literacy questions, and with a couple of others, we've actually got a research grant application in with ASSA to rethink these questions and come up with a set of questions that actually tell us whether people are really making good decisions or not. So I guess my answer is, we use these questions because they're in the literature and you're expected to have them there, but it's not clear to many people whether they're telling us anything, so you're right.
Okay. Can I just ask another to Jane Hall? So you made your black humour comment about people preferring to die at home peacefully rather than in a hospital with tubes stuck in every orifice. Now, so you're suggesting that there's a huge waste of, I think, expenditure here. I wondered if you could just say a little bit more about, well, why is that the case in your view, and how could that be changed? I mean, is it to do with a life is sacred view amongst whoever, or is it? I must say, I happened to read yesterday that in the US, the health industry, well, is the second largest donor to politics. The finance industry is the largest, and the health industry is the second. But I just wondered if you could say something a bit more about.
Yeah, probably particularly at the moment. Okay, so the reason I say most people want to die at home is surveys that have been, general population surveys that have been done here and done elsewhere. And that's what most people answer. There's also a very, I think, interesting survey of American doctors. I've only seen this in American literature. And this was asking, so a bunch of doctors, if they're at the end of their life, which of these interventions would they want? Resuscitation, a whole lot. And the only thing that over 90% wanted was pain relief. And the other percentages ranged sort of less than 30% would want any of the other things. So we know that things get done. We know that things get done because there is a sense of do something imperative rather than do nothing. And there's a lot of work going on now around advanced care directives. So asking people to think about what sort of treatment they would want under different circumstances and to see whether that makes any difference. And I don't think we know exactly how to intervene, but we also know that a lot of people will be admitted to hospital through the emergency department because something has happened. Typically there's been a fall or some other crisis. And the people staffing the emergency department are often the less experienced medical staff. And the standard reaction, of course, and there are 4-hour targets in emergency departments, so you've got to do something quickly. And the standard reaction is sort of, well, we have to get them to intensive care because we can't be seen to have not done something. That imperative seems to be much more important. So there's certainly a lot of concern and encouraging people to talk about what they want to happen at end of life. And what I want to stress is not that this is necessarily a good way to save money per se, but that it seems really silly to be spending a whole lot of money on things that people don't want. The biggest challenge we have in the healthcare system, I think, is around this value for money at the moment. And that should be about what people want, not about giving them what they don't want. Does that sort of answer the question sufficiently? I could go on, but the chair I don't think would like that.
Ian Yates, and there's one up here. Murray?
Thanks. Thanks, John. Can I just say I thought there were three extremely pertinent, relevant presentations to what we face at the moment. Just to say that Ian Yates, Coda Australia, that what Jane is saying accords totally with my daily lived experience of what older people tell me. And people may know when we were doing the aged care reform process around Mike Woods' excellent Productivity Commission report, we went with Minister Butler around the country and talked about the PC proposals to many thousands of older people. The one thing that wasn't on the PC proposals that they brought up all by themselves was greater control over dying. On Rachel's comment, can I just say, without us getting into big things, it's a really important subject. It's a difficult one to raise. I think that the way we start to get more conversation is actually to talk about creating better ways for the many older people who themselves would like to access the equity in their housing to do that, because notwithstanding your comment about mortgages, there aren't really good tools out there, and banks know that the finance for this is limited because of the illiquidity issues. Happy to have that conversation over drinks. Hazel, can I say that was just a superb presentation, and I'm just wondering, given where the government is taking us, which essentially seems to be saying, let's drive up, if you take them literally, let's drive the pensions so low that everybody will have to become somewhat more literate about their super to work out what the hell they should do to have a decent standard of living. And the figures on that are quite clear over 20 years. The pension would end up being about 18% of Matawi rather than 28%. Given your 24 years of forced learning in this area and the challenges you've given us and what you didn't touch on in the tax arrangements around super, where do you actually think we can start in changing it? Because it is back to front, and turning that around is not an easy thing to do.
Okay. So are you just talking about taxes, or are you talking about in general? In general. Well, okay. Okay. Well, I guess I'll talk about a few things. One of the things is we have to talk about retirement incomes as incomes and not superannuation, saving and accumulation. And so there needs to be superannuation policy has to be articulated as a retirement income. And that can be done in a lot of ways. The government can give guidance by defaulting people into income products. The government or superannuation funds can start talking about retirement incomes and spending as part of their member statements. So it'd be quite simple to mandate on a member statement that instead of having $500,000, you've got your superannuation will give you allow you a replacement rate or some sort of measure of income for the rest of your life. Now, I know these sorts of things have been discussed as long as I can remember. And we have a superannuation industry out there who can never agree with the government on how you actually measure these things. So how can you possibly put income on statements? What sort of assumptions do you use? I think we've got to become really pragmatic about it. Decisions have to be made. Everyone knows that, well, not everyone knows. Individuals has to be explained to individuals that these are just estimates, but giving people guidance on what their superannuation will give them to spend rather than just talking about lump sums. And it's changing the frame across the whole way that we talk about superannuation. And government, academics, industry, all the lobby groups have to start talking about income rather than assets. And as far as policy levers, now the problem is what happened in 2007 takes away the levers to use tax to do these things. Previously, we could use tax and we could tax different sorts of benefits or income streams differently and provide incentives. And because of what happened in 2007, which took away the taxation of benefits for people over 60, it's actually taking away that lever. But you can still provide defaults. Another thing that actually has to happen is there has to be a greater variety of products too. And at the moment, there's a very limited list of products that are available, so there has to be changes in regulations so that there's more products available. I could go on all day. John's looking at me, so I think we should go to another question.
We have one last question here,
I think. Thank you, Mike Woods, Productivity Commission. Yes, excellent papers. Thank you very much. And Hazel, you've talked a fair bit about the sort of illiteracy of the population with respect to super, but at least on the accumulation side, 80% just use the default system, and so provided that that is more bounded and provides proper governance, integrity, etc., is that part of the solution to this issue? But if I can also ask one of Jane, that the issue of dying well is absolutely fundamental in this debate, and despite your black humour. Are the incentives to aged care providers doing the right thing by those who they care for, or is there a fair bit of ambulance movement as soon as somebody looks like they might be dying in an aged care home to quickly call the ambulance and move them to hospital? And following that, the advanced care directives, while being a wonderful opportunity not only for a conversation with the family, but also for thinking through and deep clarification of one's own preferences, if they're not actually transmitted to the hospital, then when they turn up in ED, nobody knows about it and nobody actually undertakes it. So does something have to happen at that end as well?
Okay. I'll try and have a quick answer. With the accumulation, we now have the MySuper, which, as you say, 80% of people are in default in accumulation. And that could be considered a well-designed default, and perhaps we do need something like that in the decumulation or spending phase. One of the risks, though, with the accumulation phase is that people can set and forget. So you don't have to think about which fund, which investment. In this country, you don't even think about how much to contribute because the government's thought about that. And you're going to reach retirement, and unless there is a well-designed default, you then have to start making decisions on what sort of benefit, how to maximise the age pension. And we just heard about aged care, and we know there's quite complicated means-tested arrangements around aged care as well. And so it is a good idea to have defaults, but I think we also need to make sure that people have some understanding, because they are going to have to interact with complicated private pensions, public pensions and aged care at some stage of their lives.
If Rachel wants to say something about...
Do you want to take the second part of the question?
That's the residential...
Yeah.
I think that's me.
Right.
So I think the thing with the residential aged care is, as you say, the incentives are not for them to let people die in place. It's to call the ambulance and get them off to the hospital as fast as possible. And I think everything that Keith and I said in this presentation leads to another set of research questions that we have to go and investigate a bit more. And I think on the advanced care directives, we know even when they're there, they don't get transmitted to the hospital and they can be overridden by relatives. So I suspect the most important thing is to make sure your closest relatives know exactly what you'd like to happen and that they know how to stand up to doctors.
We're just about at the end. We're past 4:30, and I would like to begin the concluding process by thanking our speakers for this session, because I think it was a very stimulating one. So please join me.
Can we go and sit down there?
You can go and sit down if you wish. There are just a couple. I haven't been given any instructions about housekeeping, but I would like to ask you to fill out the feedback and evaluation form, if you would, and hand it, I guess, to someone out the front. And I think, although there are 5 co-conveners of this symposium, the mastermind and the person who actually owned the whole thing was Hal Kendig. And I was wondering if you'd join me in expressing our appreciation to his organisation. And finally, these things don't happen without a lot of organisation. Out of the Academy, we have Murray Radcliffe and Sunita Kumar, who worked long and hard and had many conference calls with confused academics about how to set all this up. And out of CPAR, Anne Gordon and her team, and particularly Annabella McHugh, had a lot to do with our side of things. So if we could just give them some recognition as well. I'd like to call a halt there. Thank you very much for hanging out for the whole afternoon. I do hope you found it a stimulating day.